The old yellow school bus pulled up to the gates of Riverside Academy, and 16-year-old Jake felt his stomach twist into knots. Through the dirty window, he could see students walking around in crisp uniforms, carrying expensive bags, and laughing with friends. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. Jake had been in the foster care system for 8 years now. This was his 7th placement, and honestly, he had stopped counting after the 5th one. Each time, he told himself things would be different. Each time, he was wrong. But this time felt especially scary because this wasn't just a new home, it was a new school too. And not just any school. Riverside Academy was the kind of place where rich kids went, the kind of place that appeared in magazines. His social worker, Mrs. Peterson, had explained it to him 3 weeks ago. "Jake, this is a real opportunity," she had said, shuffling through papers on her messy desk. "Riverside Academy has a program for kids like you. They take in a few students each year who need help. Full scholarship, everything paid for. Kids like you." Jake knew what that meant. Poor kids. Foster kids. Kids nobody really wanted. The bus door opened with a loud squeak, and Jake grabbed his old backpack. It was the only bag he owned, and one of the straps was held together with duct tape. As he stepped off the bus, he could feel eyes on him already. A group of students near the main entrance had stopped talking and were staring at him. He heard someone whisper something, followed by quiet laughter. "Welcome to Riverside Academy," Jake thought to himself. The main building looked like something from a V. It was made of red brick with tall windows and had ivy growing up the walls. There were perfectly cut grass areas everywhere, and the pathways were lined with flowers. Even the parking lot was fancy, filled with cars that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Jake walked toward the main entrance, trying to look like he belonged there. His uniform was new, but didn't fit quite right. The pants were a little too long, and the blazer was slightly too big in the shoulders. Mrs. Peterson had gotten it from the school's emergency supply, which Jake figured was a nice way of saying clothes for poor kids. Inside the building, things were even more impressive. The hallways had shiny marble floors that reflected the light from fancy chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. There were paintings on the walls that looked like they belonged in a museum, and everything smelled like expensive cleaning products. Mixed with fresh flowers, Jake checked the paper in his hand for his locker number and started walking down the main hallway. Students moved around him like water flowing around a rock. They all seemed to know exactly where they were going and who they were supposed to talk to. Their conversations were about weekend trips to family vacation homes, private tennis lessons, and summer camps in Europe. "Excuse me, are you the new scholarship kid?" Jake turned around to see a girl with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was surrounded by 3 other girls who all looked like they had stepped out of a fashion magazine. "I'm Jake," he said, not sure how to answer her question. "Oh, how nice," the girl said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I'm Ashley. We heard someone new was joining us today." "Where are you from?" Jake hesitated. He had learned that telling people about foster care usually led to awkward questions or looks of pity. "Around here," he said simply. "Around here?" "How interesting. And where did you go to school before this?" "Lincoln Middle School," Jake answered, naming his last school. The girls exchanged looks. Jake could tell they knew Lincoln Middle School's reputation. It wasn't good. "Well," Ashley said, her smile getting even faker, "I'm sure you'll love it here. Everything is very different from what you're probably used to." After the girls walked away, Jake found his locker and tried to figure out the combination. The metal was cold under his fingers, and for a moment, he had the crazy thought that maybe he could just climb inside and hide until the day was over. His first class was English literature. The teacher, Mr. Harrison, seemed nice enough, but Jake could feel the other students looking at him as he walked in. The only empty seat was in the front row, which meant everyone behind him could stare at the back of his head all period. "Today we're discussing the themes in The Great Gatsby," Mr. Harrison announced. "Can anyone tell me what Fitzgerald was trying to say about the American dream?" Several hands shot up immediately. The students talked about symbolism and metaphors and social commentary like it was the most natural thing in the world. Jake had read the book at his previous school, but listening to these kids talk about it made him feel like he had read a completely different story. During the discussion, a boy named Connor made a comment about how some people will never understand the finer things in life because they weren't raised with them. He didn't look at Jake when he said it, but something about the way he paused made Jake think the comment was meant for him. Lunch was the worst part of the day. The cafeteria looked more like a fancy restaurant than a school lunchroom. There were round tables with actual tablecloths, and the food was served on real plates instead of plastic trays. Jake got his lunch, which was free, thanks to his scholarship, and looked around for somewhere to sit. Every table seemed to be full of students who had been friends since childhood. They talked about people Jake didn't know and places Jake had never been. He finally found an empty table in the corner and sat down by himself. As he ate his lunch in silence, Jake watched the other students. They moved through the world with a confidence he had never felt. They knew they belonged here. They knew their parents would pick them up after school and ask about their day. They knew they would wake up in the same bed tomorrow morning, and the morning after that. Jake had learned not to expect that kind of stability. In 8 years of foster care, he had lived in 12 different houses. Some were better than others, but none of them ever felt permanent. He had gotten good at packing quickly and not getting too attached to anything or anyone. The afternoon classes were more of the same. In history, they discussed the economic policies of different presidents, and Jake realized that most of his classmates' families had probably been affected by those policies in very different ways than his had. In science, they talked about expensive equipment and field trips to research facilities that cost more than Jake's foster family spent on groceries in a month. By the time the final bell rang, Jake felt exhausted. Not from studying, but from trying to fit in somewhere he clearly didn't belong. As he walked to the bus pickup area, he overheard a conversation that made his stomach drop. "Did you see the new kid?" one student was saying to his friend. "My dad says they're bringing in more charity cases every year. Pretty soon this place is going to be just like a public school." "I know, right? My parents pay good money for me to go here. They shouldn't have to mix with people like that." Jake kept walking, pretending he hadn't heard. But the words followed him onto the bus and all the way back to his foster home. As he sat in his small bedroom that night, looking out the window at the neighborhood around him, he wondered how long it would be before someone decided this placement wasn't working out either. He had survived worse things than snobbish classmates, he told himself. He just had to keep his head down, do his work, and try not to give anyone a reason to notice him. In his experience, being invisible was usually the safest way to get through each day. But as Jake would soon learn, sometimes life has other plans. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try to stay invisible, the world has a way of pulling you into the spotlight whether you want it or not. By the end of his first week at Riverside Academy, Jake had learned 3 important things. First, the food in the cafeteria was actually pretty good. Second, if he kept quiet and didn't ask questions, most teachers would leave him alone. And third, there was a group of boys who had decided to make his life miserable. The leader of this group was Blake Ashford, and everything about him screamed money and privilege. His uniform was perfectly tailored, his shoes were always shiny, and he wore a watch that probably cost more than a car. Blake's father owned half the businesses in town and was the biggest donor to Riverside Academy. There was even a building named after their family. Blake had dark hair that was always perfectly styled, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about anything in his entire life. He walked through the school like he owned it, which in a way he kind of did. Teachers smiled extra bright when they saw him, and other students moved out of his way in the hallways. At first, Jake thought Blake might just ignore him. After all, what would someone like Blake want with someone like Jake? They lived in completely different worlds. But Jake was wrong. Very wrong. It started small. On Monday morning of his second week, Jake opened his locker to find all his books scattered on the floor. Nothing was missing, but everything was messed up. He looked around to see if anyone had noticed, but the hallway was busy with students rushing to class. "Oops," came a voice behind him. "Looks like someone had an accident." Jake turned to see Blake standing there with two of his friends, Cameron and Tyler. All three of them were smiling, but not in a friendly way. "Yeah," Jake said quietly, bending. "Down to pick up his books. Looks like it." "You know," Blake said, not moving to help, "you should be more careful with your things. Especially since they're probably not easy to replace." Jake's face got hot, but he didn't say anything. He had learned a long time ago that fighting back usually made things worse. He just gathered his books and walked away, hearing the three boys laugh behind him. The next day, it was his lunch. Jake had saved his meal until last period because he had missed breakfast at his foster home. When he opened his backpack, he found that someone had poured orange juice all over his sandwich and apple. The bag was sticky and smelled sweet in a gross way. "Problem?" Blake appeared next to his desk like magic. "No problem," Jake said, trying to clean up the mess with some tissues. "That's weird. It looks like you have a problem." Blake's voice was loud enough that other students started looking over. "Maybe you should be more careful about what you put in your bag." Jake's stomach growled loudly, but he didn't say anything. He spent the rest of the period hungry, listening to his classmates discuss their weekend plans to go skiing at some resort he had never heard of. By Thursday, things got worse. Someone had written "charity case" on his locker in black marker. Jake spent 20 minutes before school trying to scrub it off, but he could still see the faint outline of the letters. During gym class, his regular clothes disappeared from his locker, and he had to wear his uniform for the rest of the day, which made him stand out even more. "Hey, Jake," Blake called out during lunch on Friday. He was sitting at a table with 6 other students, all of them looking over at Jake with amused expressions. "My friends and I were wondering something." Jake tried to ignore him and keep eating, but Blake wasn't the type to be ignored. "We were wondering if foster kids get instruction manuals. Like when you adopt a dog from the shelter." The table exploded in laughter. Jake felt his face turn red, but he forced himself to keep chewing his food and looking straight ahead. "I mean," Blake continued, clearly enjoying himself, "it must be confusing for families, right? Taking in random kids and not knowing what kind of problems they might have." More laughter. Jake's hands were shaking now, but he kept them under the table where no one could see. "Blake, that's enough." The voice came from Ashley, the blonde girl who had talked to Jake on his first day. She was sitting at a nearby table with her friends. "What? I'm just asking questions," Blake said innocently. "I think it's great that the school is helping kids like Jake. It's very charitable of us." That word, charitable, hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. He had heard it before at other schools in other situations. It always made him feel small and unwanted, like he was some kind of burden that people had to deal with out of the goodness of their hearts. The harassment wasn't just during lunch. In English class, when Mr. Harrison asked students to share their thoughts about a poem, Blake would make comments like, "I don't think everyone here can relate to these complex emotions." In history, when they discussed the Great Depression, Blake mentioned how some people just never learn to manage money properly, even when they're given help. Jake knew that Blake was talking about him, and Blake knew that Jake knew. But everything was said in a way that seemed innocent to any adults who might be listening. Blake was smart about it. He never said anything directly mean or threatening. He just made sure Jake felt like an outsider every single day. The worst part was that the teachers seemed to love Blake. When he answered questions in class, they would nod approvingly and say things like, "Excellent insight, Blake." When he turned in assignments late, they would smile and say, "No problem at all." Jake quickly realized that complaining about Blake would be like complaining about the school's favorite son, Jake's foster parents. Mr. and Mrs. Chun were nice people, but they were also busy. Mr. Chun worked 2 jobs, and Mrs. Chun was taking care of her elderly mother while also looking after 2 other foster kids. They asked Jake how school was going, and he always said fine, because he didn't want to cause them any trouble. They had enough problems already. Besides, what would he tell them? That some rich kids were being mean to him? That didn't sound like a real problem compared to everything else going on in the world. Jake had learned to handle his own problems a long time ago. The bullying wasn't just verbal. Blake and his friends had a talent for making Jake's life difficult in small ways. That would be hard to prove. His gym clothes would go missing. His homework would disappear from his desk. Someone would bump into him in the hallway just hard enough to make him drop his books. One afternoon, Jake was walking to his locker when he overheard Blake talking to Cameron and Tyler. "My dad was asking about the scholarship kids at dinner last night," Blake was saying. "He thinks the school is being too generous. He's worried about the kind of influence they might have on the rest of us." "What did you tell him?" Cameron asked. "I told him not to worry. Kids like that don't usually last very long anyway. They figure out pretty quickly that they don't belong here." Jake felt sick to his stomach. Was that true? Did scholarship kids usually leave? He thought about asking Mrs. Peterson, but he was afraid of what she might tell him. That night, Jake lay in bed staring at the ceiling and wondering if Blake was right. Maybe he didn't belong at Riverside Academy? Maybe he should just ask to. Transfer back to a regular public school where he could blend in better. But then he remembered what Mrs. Peterson had told him when she first told him about the scholarship. "This could change your whole future, Jake. Schools like Riverside Academy open doors that stay closed for most people." Jake didn't want to give up. He had been through worse things than dealing with Blake Ashford. He had survived moving from house to house, changing schools, losing friends, and starting over more times than he could count. A few mean comments from a spoiled rich kid weren't going to break him, at least. That's what he told himself as he finally fell asleep. He had no idea that Blake was just getting started, and that the real test of his strength was still coming. 3 weeks into his time at Riverside Academy, Jake had developed a routine that helped him survive each day. He would get to school early and go straight to the library, where it was quiet and Blake's group rarely bothered him. During lunch, he would eat quickly and then find somewhere to hide until the next period started. After school, he would walk slowly to the bus, hoping to avoid any final confrontations before going home. But on this particular Tuesday, something went wrong with his plan. Jake had finished his lunch and was heading toward his usual hiding spot. In the library, when he saw Blake and his friends already there, probably working on some group project, Jake quickly turned around and walked in the opposite direction, but he could hear Blake's voice behind him. "Hey, Jake! Where are you going? Come join us." Jake walked faster, pretending he hadn't heard. He turned down a hallway he had never explored before, hoping to find another quiet place to spend the rest of lunch period. The hallway was older than the main part of the school, with worn wooden floors and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years, most of the doors along. The hallway were locked, but Jake kept trying each one, looking for somewhere to sit down and maybe finish his homework. Finally, about halfway down the hall, he found a door that opened. The room inside took his breath away. It was clearly supposed to be a music room, but it looked like no one had used it in years. Dust particles floated in the sunlight that streamed through tall, dirty windows. There were music stands scattered around, some of them folded up and leaning against the walls. Old sheet music was piled on a table near the door, and everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. But what really caught Jake's attention was the piano. It sat in the far corner of the room, an old upright piano with dark wood that had seen better days. Some of the wood was scratched, and a few of the keys were yellowed with age. But even from across the room, Jake could tell it was real. Not an electronic keyboard, not a toy, but an actual piano. Jake had never told anyone at Riverside Academy about his interest in music. It wasn't something that came up in conversations, and besides, he had learned to keep personal information to himself. But the truth was, Jake loved music more than almost anything else in the world when he was 12 years old. He had lived with a foster family called the Johnsons. Mrs. Johnson had been a music teacher before she retired, and she had an old electronic keyboard in her living room. Jake would watch her play sometimes in the evenings, mesmerized by the way her fingers moved across the keys and how she could create such beautiful sounds. One day, when Mrs. Johnson was out grocery shopping, Jake had snuck over to the keyboard and tried to copy what he had seen her do. To his surprise, he could figure out simple melodies just by listening and experimenting. When Mrs. Johnson came home and found him playing, she didn't get angry. Instead, she sat down next to him and started teaching him basic songs. For 3 months, Jake had learned everything Mrs. Johnson could teach him. She showed him how to read basic sheet music, how to use both hands at the same time, and how to play songs by ear. It was the happiest Jake had ever been in a foster home. But then Mr. Johnson lost his job, and they couldn't afford to keep taking care of foster kids anymore. Jake had to move to a new family, and he never saw the Johnsons again. His next foster home didn't have any musical instruments, and neither did the one after that. Now, standing in this forgotten music room, Jake felt like he had discovered buried treasure. He walked slowly toward the piano, looking over his shoulder to make sure. No one had followed him. The room was completely silent except for the sound of his footsteps on the old wooden floor. When he reached the piano, he gently lifted the cover that protected the keys. The keys were dusty, but they looked like they were in decent shape. Jake pressed middle C very softly, afraid the sound would be too loud and attract attention. The note rang out clear and true, filling the empty room with a sound that seemed almost magical after weeks of silence and hostility. Jake looked toward the door again, listening for footsteps in the hallway. When he was sure he was alone, he sat down on the piano bench and placed his hands on the keys. It had been 4 years since he had played a real piano, but his fingers seemed to remember what to do. He started with a simple scale, just to see how the piano sounded. Then he tried a basic song that Mrs. Johnson had taught him years ago. The melody came back to him like he had played it yesterday, and for the first time since arriving at Riverside Academy, Jake felt truly happy. The piano wasn't in perfect condition. A few of the keys stuck a little bit, and some of the notes sounded slightly out of tune. But to Jake, it sounded beautiful. Each note seemed to wash away some of the stress and loneliness he had been carrying around for weeks. He played quietly for about 10 minutes. Trying songs he remembered and experimenting with new melodies. The music seemed to fill up all the empty spaces inside him that had been created by Blake's constant harassment and the feeling of not belonging anywhere. When the bell rang to signal the end of lunch period, Jake reluctantly closed the piano cover and stood up. He looked around the room one more time, memorizing every detail. The dust particles still floated in the sunlight. The old sheet music still sat in messy piles, and everything still looked forgotten and abandoned. But now Jake had a secret. He had found something in this school that belonged to him, something that Blake couldn't take away or ruin. For the first time in weeks, he smiled as he walked back to class. The rest of the day seemed to go by faster than usual. Jake found himself thinking about the piano during history class, wondering what other songs he might remember. During English, he thought about the way the room had felt so peaceful and quiet, like a sanctuary in the middle of a storm that night. At dinner, Mrs. Chun asked him how his day had been. Better than usual, Jake said, and for once he actually meant it. That's good to hear, Mr. Chun said, passing Jake the rice. I was worried you were having trouble adjusting to the new school. It's getting easier, Jake said. He didn't mention the bullying and he didn't mention the piano. Some things were too precious to share, especially when you weren't sure how long they would last. The next day, Jake couldn't wait for lunch period. He ate his sandwich as quickly as possible and then made his way back to the forgotten hallway. The door to the music room was still unlocked, and everything was exactly as he had left it. This time, he was a little more adventurous with his playing. He tried to remember a piece by Chopin that Mrs. Johnson had played for him once. He couldn't remember all of it, but he could figure out the main melody. And that was enough. As the days went by, Jake developed a new routine. Every lunch period, he would sneak away to the music room and play for 20 or 30 minutes. He started bringing a small towel from home to wipe the dust off the keys, and he even found some old sheet music in the pile that he could actually read. The piano became his escape from everything that was difficult about Riverside Academy. When Blake made cruel comments, Jake would think about the music room. When he felt lonely and out of place, he would remember the feeling of his fingers on the keys and the sound of the notes filling the empty space around him. Jake didn't know it yet, but his discovery of the music room was about to change everything. Blake and his friends were starting to notice that Jake disappeared every day during lunch, and they were getting curious about where he went. But for now, Jake was just happy to have found something that made him feel like himself again, in a world where everything seemed designed to remind him that he didn't belong. The piano was the one thing that felt like home. 2 weeks after discovering the music room, Jake's lunch periods had become the best part of his day. What had started as simple scales and basic songs had grown into something much more impressive. Each day, he found himself remembering more pieces, and each day, his fingers seemed to move with more confidence across the keys. Jake had always been good at picking up melodies by ear, but he was starting to realize that his musical abilities went deeper than he had ever understood. When he played songs he had only heard a few times, his hands seemed to know where to go next. When he experimented with his own variations on familiar tunes, the results sounded natural and beautiful. On this particular Friday, Jake decided to try something more challenging. He had been thinking about a piece he had heard on the radio the week before, something classical and complex with lots of fast-moving notes and dramatic pauses. He wasn't sure what it was called, but the melody had stuck in his head. He sat down at the piano and placed his hands on the keys, trying to remember how the piece had started. After a few false starts, he found the opening melody and began to play. As he continued, his muscle memory seemed to take over, guiding his fingers through passages that he had never learned but somehow understood, the music that came out of the old piano was unlike anything Jake had ever played before. It was emotional and powerful, with moments of softness that made his heart ache and moments of intensity that made his pulse race. He lost track of time completely, getting lost in the complex rhythms and beautiful harmonies. He was so focused on the music that he didn't hear the door to the music room open. Wow! Jake's hands froze on the keys and he spun around on the piano bench. Standing in the doorway was a girl he recognized from his English class, Lily, a quiet student who always sat in the back row and rarely spoke up during discussions. "I'm sorry," Jake said quickly, standing up from the piano. "I know I'm probably not supposed to be in here." No, don't stop," Lily said, stepping into the room. "That was incredible. What was that piece?" Jake felt his face turn red. "I don't actually know the name of it. I just heard it somewhere and tried to figure it out." Lily stared at him with wide eyes. "You learned that by ear?" That sounded like professional level playing. "It's not that good," Jake said, embarrassed by the praise. "The piano is out of tune and I made a lot of mistakes." "I've been taking piano lessons for 8 years, Lily said, walking closer to the piano. "Trust me, what you just played was amazing. Where did you learn to play like that?" Jake hesitated. He had gotten so used to hiding parts of himself that it felt strange to have someone asking genuine questions about his interests. "I had some lessons a few years ago," he said. "Finally. But mostly I just mess around and see what sounds good. Can you play something else?" Lily asked. "I promise I won't tell anyone you're using this room. I was actually looking for a quiet place to study when I heard the music." Jake looked at her carefully, trying to decide if he could trust her. Lily had always seemed nice in class, and she had never joined in when other students made fun of him. Besides, it felt good to have someone appreciate his playing. "Okay," he said, sitting back down at the piano. "But only if you promise not to laugh if I mess up." "Deal," Lily said, settling into one of the dusty chairs near the piano. Jake thought for a moment, then began playing a piece that Mrs. Johnson had taught him years ago. A gentle, flowing melody that always made him think of water moving over stones. As he played, he could feel Lily listening intently, and instead of making him nervous, her attention somehow made him play even better. When he finished, Lily was quiet for a long moment. "Jake," she said finally, "do you realize how talented you are?" Jake shrugged. "It's just a hobby. It's not like I could do anything serious with it." "Are you kidding me? You could definitely do something serious with this. Have you ever thought about applying to music schools? Or entering competitions?" Jake almost laughed, but he could tell Lily was being sincere. "I don't think music schools are really for people like me," he said. "What do you mean, people like you?" Jake didn't know how to explain without getting into his whole life story. I just mean ... it's complicated. Music is expensive. Lessons, instruments, competitions, all of that costs money that I don't have. Lily was quiet for a moment, and Jake worried that he had said too much. But when she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful rather than pitying. You know, some of the greatest musicians in history came from difficult backgrounds, she said. They didn't succeed because they had money. They succeeded because they had talent and determination. Jake wanted to believe her, but he had learned to be realistic about his limitations. Maybe, he said. But those are just stories. In real life, opportunities usually go to people who can afford them. Not always, Lily said. My piano teacher tells me about scholarships and programs for talented students all the time. There are people who specifically look for kids with natural ability, regardless of their background. Jake had never heard about anything like that, but then, again, he had never really looked into it either. For so long, music had just been something he did for fun, a way to escape from stress and loneliness. He had never seriously considered that it could be more than that. Can you play anything else? Lily asked. I could listen to you all day. Jake felt a warm feeling in his chest. It had been so long since anyone had shown genuine interest in something he was good at. Most of the time, he felt like he was just trying to survive each day. Without making any mistakes or drawing too much attention to himself, he began playing another piece. This one more upbeat and energetic. As his fingers moved across the keys, he realized that having an audience, even an audience of one, made the music feel more alive. He found himself taking more risks, trying more complex variations, and putting more emotion into his playing. You're really good at this, Lily said when he finished. Like, seriously good. You should think about joining the school's music program. Does Riverside Academy have a music program? Jake asked. He had been so focused on just getting through his regular classes that he hadn't looked into any extracurricular activities. Yeah. There's a whole music department. They have chorus, band, orchestra, and individual lessons. Plus, they put on concerts and participate in competitions. Jake thought about it for a moment, but then shook his head. I don't think that's for me. Those programs are probably full of kids who have been taking lessons their whole lives and have expensive instruments. So? You're better than most of them already, and you taught yourself. Imagine how good you could be with some proper training. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period. Jake quickly closed the piano cover and gathered his backpack. Thanks for listening, he said to Lily as they walked toward the door. Thank you for playing, she said. Seriously, Jake, you have something special. Don't waste it. As they walked back toward the main part of the school, Jake's mind was spinning with thoughts he had never allowed himself to have before. What if Lily was right? What if his musical ability really was something special? What if there were opportunities out there that he had never considered? But even as these hopeful thoughts crossed his mind, Jake tried to push them away. He had learned not to get his hopes up too high, because disappointment hurt less when you weren't expecting much in the first place. Still, as he sat through his afternoon classes, Jake found himself thinking about what Lily had said about scholarships and programs for talented students. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to his future than he had ever imagined. He had no idea that Blake had been asking around about his daily disappearances, and that his secret sanctuary was about to be discovered by the very people he had been trying to avoid. Blake Ashford was not used to being ignored, and Jake's daily disappearances during lunch had become an irritating mystery that he was determined to solve. For weeks now, the foster kid had been slipping away right after eating, and Blake's attempts to follow him had been unsuccessful. Jake seemed to have developed an annoying talent for vanishing into thin air. It's like he just disappears, Cameron complained to Blake as they sat in the library during lunch on Monday. Yesterday I saw him walking toward the east wing, but by the time I got there, he was gone. Nobody just disappears, Blake said, his jaw clenched with frustration. He's hiding somewhere in this school, and I'm going to find out where. Tyler looked up from his phone. Why do you even care? Let the loser go sit by himself somewhere. Isn't that what we want? Blake's eyes narrowed. The truth was, he couldn't explain exactly why Jake's disappearances bothered him so much. Maybe it was because he was used to having complete control over the social dynamics at Riverside Academy. Maybe it was because Jake's quiet refusal to engage with the harassment made Blake feel like he was losing some kind of game he didn't even realize he was playing. "It's the principle of the thing," Blake said finally. "He thinks he can just ignore us and go off and do whatever he wants. That's not how things work around here." What Blake didn't say was that Jake's ability to seem unaffected by the bullying was starting to make Blake look weak in front of his friends. Other students were beginning to notice that the scholarship kid wasn't breaking down or fighting back the way previous targets had. Some people were even starting to seem impressed by Jake's quiet resilience. That afternoon, Blake decided to take a more systematic approach. Instead of trying to follow Jake himself, he recruited some younger students to help with surveillance. He told them it was just a harmless prank and offered to pay them $20 each if they could figure out where Jake went during lunch. It took 3 days, but finally one of the younger kids came back with information. "He goes to the old music room," the kid reported, excited to have earned his $20. "It's in the east wing, down that hallway nobody uses anymore. I saw him go in there and I listened at the door. He's playing piano." Blake stared at the kid in disbelief. "Piano? Are you sure?" "Positive. And he's actually pretty good at it. I listened for like 10 minutes. Blake dismissed the kid and sat back in his chair, his mind already working on a plan. Piano. That was interesting. That was also potentially very useful. The next day, Blake and his friends positioned themselves near the east wing during lunch and waited. Sure enough, after about 10 minutes, they saw Jake walking quickly down the old hallway. Looking over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching, they followed him quietly and stopped outside the door to the music room. Inside, they could hear the clear sound of piano music. Blake had to admit, even through the closed door, it sounded impressive. "Wow," Cameron whispered. "He's actually really good." "Shut up," Blake hissed, but he was thinking the same thing. The music was complex and emotional. Nothing like the simple songs they had learned in elementary school music class. Blake listened for a few more minutes, his mind racing with possibilities. Then he motioned for his friends to follow him back down the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Tyler asked when they were far enough away to talk normally. "That was like professional level playing. Where did he learn to do that?" "I don't care where he learned," Blake said. "What matters is that we can use it." Cameron looked confused. "Use it how?" Blake smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. "You'll see, but first I need to make some phone calls." That evening, Blake sat in his father's home office, using the landline. To call the school? When the receptionist answered, he put on his most polite, helpful voice. "Hi, this is Blake Ashford. I'm a student there, and I wanted to talk to someone about the upcoming spring fundraising gala." "Oh, hello, Blake," the receptionist said warmly. Everyone at the school knew the Ashford name. "What can I help you with?" "Well, I've been thinking about ways to make this year's gala extra special, and I had an idea. We have this new scholarship student, Jake, who's incredibly talented at piano. I was thinking it might be really inspiring for the donors to see how their contributions are helping kids develop their talents." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's a wonderful suggestion, Blake. Very thoughtful of you. Let me transfer you to Mrs. Williams, who's organizing the entertainment for the gala." Blake waited, drumming his fingers on his father's expensive desk. This was going to be perfect. "Hello, this is Mrs. Williams," came a cheerful voice. Blake repeated his suggestion, making sure to emphasize how inspiring it would be for the wealthy donors to see their charity in action. He painted a picture of Jake as a talented but disadvantaged kid who would be grateful for the opportunity to perform. "What a lovely idea," Mrs. Williams said. "And you say this student is quite talented?" "Oh, yes," Blake said, and for once he wasn't lying. "I've heard him play, and it's really impressive. I think the donors would be amazed to see what their money is helping to accomplish." "I'll need to check with Jake and make sure he's interested," Mrs. Williams said. "But if he's willing, I think this could be a wonderful addition to the program." I'm sure he'll be excited about the opportunity, Blake said smoothly. Thank you so much for considering it. After he hung up, Blake sat back in his father's leather chair and smiled. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. Now he just had to wait for Mrs. Williams to approach. Jake about performing at the gala. Blake knew that Jake would probably say yes. Kids like him didn't usually turn down opportunities to impress important people, especially when those people controlled his future at the school. And once Jake agreed to perform, Blake could move on to phase 2 of his plan. The spring fundraising gala was Riverside Academy's biggest event of the year. All the wealthiest families in town attended, along with local politicians and business leaders. It was held in the school's grand ballroom, with fancy decorations, expensive catering, and entertainment that usually featured professional musicians. Having Jake perform at such an important event would put him in front of everyone who mattered at the school. If he succeeded, he would become the poster child for the scholarship program, which would be annoying but not devastating. But Blake wasn't planning to let Jake succeed. Over the next few days, Blake started making additional phone calls and having quiet conversations with people who worked at the school. He was careful to be subtle about it, framing everything as helpful suggestions or innocent questions. He asked the maintenance staff about the pianos in the building, claiming he was writing a report for music class. He learned that there were 3 pianos at Riverside Academy, a brand new grand piano in the main auditorium, a decent upright piano in the regular music classroom, and the old, somewhat damaged piano in the abandoned music room. Blake also started asking around about Jake's background, being careful to sound sympathetic rather than nosy. He learned that Jake had been in foster care for years, that he had never had formal music lessons, and that he had no family who could afford to help him if something went wrong. All of this information was valuable because it confirmed what Blake already suspected. Jake was vulnerable. He had no safety net, no powerful connections, and no resources to fall back on if he failed publicly. The gala was still 2 weeks away, which gave Blake plenty of time to make sure everything went according to his plan. He had always been good at manipulating situations to his advantage, and this was going to be his masterpiece. Jake had no idea what was coming. He was still spending his lunch periods in the music room, still playing beautiful music on the old piano, still believing that his talent was his own private sanctuary that no one could touch. But Blake was about to prove him very, very wrong. Mrs. Williams found Jake in the hallway between classes on a Thursday morning, her face bright with excitement. Jake barely knew who she was. He had seen her around the school but had never actually spoken to her before. "Jake, I'm so glad I caught you," she said, slightly out of breath from hurrying to find him. "I'm Mrs. Williams, and I organize events for the school. I have the most wonderful opportunity to discuss with you." Jake shifted his backpack nervously. In his experience, adults who approached him with wonderful opportunities usually had something in mind that he wouldn't actually find wonderful at all. "Okay," he said cautiously. "One of your fellow students mentioned that you're quite the pianist," Mrs. Williams continued, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "And it got me thinking about our spring fundraising gala next week. We always have entertainment, usually professional musicians, but this year I thought it might be even more meaningful to showcase the talent of our own students." Jake's stomach dropped. "I'm sorry, what?" "I'd love for you to perform at the gala. It would be such an inspiring way to show our donors how their contributions are helping students like you develop your gifts. The whole community would be there. It would be quite an audience." Jake felt like he couldn't breathe properly. Perform? In front of the whole community? In front of all the wealthy donors who funded his scholarship? "I don't think that's a good idea," he said quickly. Not really good enough for something like that. I just play for fun." "Oh, nonsense." Mrs. Williams waved away his protests. "I'm sure you're being modest. And even if you're not at a professional level yet, that's not the point. The point is to show these generous people that their money is making a real difference in young lives." Jake's face burned with embarrassment. He hated being talked about like he was some kind of charity case that needed to be displayed for the entertainment of rich people. "Really, I don't think I should," he tried again. Maybe you could find someone else, Jake, Mrs. Williams said, her tone becoming more serious. I hope you understand what an honor this is. Most students would be thrilled to have this kind of opportunity. And honestly, it would mean a lot to the school administration to see our scholarship students participating in important events like this. The way she said it made Jake understand that this wasn't really a request. It was an expectation. If he refused, it would look ungrateful and uncooperative. It might even affect his standing at the school. What would I have to play? He asked. Reluctantly, whatever you'd like. Something that showcases your abilities? Maybe something classical? The donors tend to appreciate more traditional music. Jake nodded miserably. Okay, I guess I can do it. Wonderful. Mrs. Williams clapped her hands together. The gala is next Friday evening. We'll need you there by 6 o'clock for a sound. Check and Jake? You might want to get a haircut and make sure your best clothes are clean. This is a very formal event. As Mrs. Williams walked away, Jake leaned against the wall and tried to process what had just happened. He was going to have to perform in front of hundreds of people, including all the most important and wealthy families in town, including Blake and his parents. The thought made Jake's chest tighten with anxiety. He had never performed for anyone, except Lily, and that had been in the safety of the abandoned music room. The idea of sitting at a piano in front of a huge audience, knowing that everyone was watching him and judging him, made him feel sick, but there was no way out of it now. Mrs. Williams had made it clear that refusing wasn't really an option. Meanwhile, Blake was putting the finishing touches on his plan. Over the past week, he had been having seemingly innocent conversations with key people around the school. He had mentioned to the head of maintenance, Mr. Rodriguez, that it would be really meaningful if Jake could perform on the same piano he had been practicing on in the music room. It would be like a symbol, Blake had said earnestly, showing how he's taken something old and forgotten and made it beautiful again. Mr. Rodriguez had thought this was a touching idea and agreed to move the old piano from the music room, too. The ballroom for the gala, Blake had also been spreading carefully crafted rumors among the student body. He told people that Jake was incredibly nervous about the performance and that he had been struggling with the pressure. He made sure to sound concerned and sympathetic when he said these things, so it seemed like he was trying to be helpful, rather than harmful. I just hope he doesn't freeze up, Blake said to a group of students on Wednesday. It would be so embarrassing for him if he messed up in front of all those important people. By Thursday, word had spread throughout the school that Jake was going to perform at the gala and that he was apparently very anxious about it. Some students seemed genuinely excited to see what he could do, but others, especially Blake's friends, were clearly expecting some kind of disaster. The worst part of Blake's plan was still secret, though. On Thursday afternoon, he approached Mr. Rodriguez with another helpful suggestion. I was thinking, Blake said, since Jake has been practicing on that old piano, maybe we should have it tuned before the gala? Just to make sure it sounds its best for such an important event. That's thoughtful of you, Blake, Mr. Rodriguez said. But honestly, the school doesn't have money in the budget for piano tuning right now. And besides, if the kid has been practicing on it as it is, he's probably used to how it sounds. Blake nodded understandingly. You're probably right. I just want everything to go well for him, What Mr. Rodriguez didn't know was that Blake had no intention of having the piano tuned. In fact, he had the opposite plan in mind late Thursday night. Blake snuck back into the school using his father's master key, a privilege that came with being the son of the school's biggest donor. He made his way to the ballroom, where the old piano had already been moved and positioned on the small stage. Blake wasn't a musician himself, but he had done his research. He carefully loosened several keys so they would stick when pressed. He adjusted some of the internal strings so they would sound noticeably out of tune. He even loosened one of the pedals so it would make a squeaking sound when used. The damage was subtle enough that someone casually looking at the piano wouldn't notice anything wrong. But when Jake sat down to play, especially in front of a quiet, attentive audience, every flaw would be glaringly obvious. Blake stood back and admired his work. The piano looked fine from a distance, but it was sabotaged in ways that would make any performance sound terrible. Even if Jake was as talented as he seemed to be, no one could make beautiful music on an instrument that had been deliberately damaged. The plan was perfect. Jake would sit down at the piano in front of hundreds of important people, expecting to showcase his talent. Instead, he would discover that his instrument was broken, and he would have no choice but to either quit in embarrassment or struggle through a performance that sounded awful either way. He would be humiliated in front of the exact people who controlled his future at Riverside Academy. The scholarship students who had come before Jake had usually left the school after much smaller embarrassments than this. Blake was confident that this public failure would convince Jake to transfer somewhere else, finally solving Blake's problem. Once and for all. As Blake locked up the school and headed home, he felt satisfied with his work. In less than 24 hours, the foster kid who had dared to ignore his harassment would learn exactly what happened to people who didn't know their place at Riverside Academy. Blake had no idea that his cruel plan was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. Friday evening arrived faster than Jake had hoped. He stood in the bathroom at his foster home, staring at himself in the mirror and trying to calm his racing heart. Mr. Chan had driven him to a discount store earlier that day to buy a white dress shirt and black tie, and Mrs. Chan had given him her best attempt at a haircut using kitchen scissors. Jake looked presentable, but he felt terrified. "You're going to do great," Mrs. Chan had told him as she straightened his tie. "We're so proud of you for this opportunity." Jake had smiled and nodded, not wanting to worry her by admitting how scared he was. The truth was, he had barely slept all week. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined himself sitting at a piano in front of hundreds of strangers, his mind going blank and his fingers forgetting how to move. The ride to Riverside Academy felt like it lasted forever and no time at all. When they pulled up to the school, Jake could see that the place had been transformed. The parking lot was full of expensive cars, and people in fancy clothes were walking toward the main entrance. Everyone looked like they belonged in a magazine. "Do you want me to walk in with you?" Mr. Chen asked gently. Jake shook his head. "I think I'm supposed to go to the back entrance. Mrs. Williams said performers should come in through the stage door." "Okay, we'll be in the audience cheering for you." "Break a leg, kiddo." Jake made his way around to the back of the building, his stomach churning with every step. The stage door was propped open, and he could hear voices and activity inside. When he walked in, he found Mrs. Williams rushing around with a clipboard, coordinating with caterers and checking on decorations. "Jake, there you are," she said when she spotted him. "You look very handsome. Are you ready for your sound check?" Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Mrs. Williams led him through a short hallway and then through a curtain onto the stage. The ballroom beyond was enormous, with round tables covered in white tablecloths and fancy centerpieces. Hundreds of chairs were arranged around the room, and people in suits and evening gowns were already starting to take their seats. But what caught Jake's attention was the piano. It was the same old upright piano from the music room, but something was wrong. Even from several feet away, Jake could see that some of the keys were sitting at odd angles. When he got closer, he realized that several keys were actually stuck in the down position. "Mrs. Williams," Jake said, his voice cracking slightly, "I think there's something wrong with the piano." She hurried over and looked where Jake was pointing. "Oh my, that is strange. It looked fine when they moved it this morning." Jake pressed a few keys experimentally. Some of them worked normally, but others stuck or made buzzing sounds. When he tried the pedals, one of them squeaked loudly. "Can we get a different piano?" Jake asked, trying not to sound as panicked as he felt. Mrs. Williams looked around the room helplessly. "I don't think so." This was the only piano available, and the guests are already arriving. The program is supposed to start in 30 minutes. Jake's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. This was exactly what he had been afraid of. Something going wrong and making him look stupid in front of all these important people. "Maybe I shouldn't perform," he said quietly. "Maybe you could just skip that part of the program." "Oh no." "Jake, we can't do that. Your performance is listed in the program, and I've already told several major donors about it. They're specifically looking forward to hearing you play." Jake felt trapped. He couldn't perform on a broken piano, but he also couldn't back out without disappointing everyone and probably getting in trouble with the school administration. Maybe you could just do your best with it? Mrs. Williams suggested. I'm sure people will understand if it doesn't sound perfect. Jake wanted to laugh, but not in a good way. Do his best? With a piano that was literally falling apart? In front of hundreds of people who expected him to prove that their charity money was being well spent. Through a gap in the curtain, Jake could see that the ballroom was filling up. He spotted Blake sitting at a table near the front with his parents and several other well-dressed adults. Blake was smiling and talking animatedly. Looking completely relaxed and confident, that's when Jake realized what had happened. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad luck or poor timing. This was sabotage. Blake had somehow arranged for this broken piano to be brought here, knowing that Jake would have no choice but to try to perform on it. The realization hit Jake like a physical blow. Blake hadn't just been content to make his daily life miserable with small harassment and cruel comments. He had orchestrated this entire situation to humiliate Jake in the most public way possible. For a moment, Jake felt completely defeated. He thought about walking off the stage and out of the building, never to return to Riverside Academy again. He thought about giving Blake exactly what he wanted, a complete surrender, but then something else happened. Instead of feeling more scared, Jake started feeling angry. He was angry at Blake for being so cruel and calculating. He was angry at the school for putting him in this situation. He was angry at a world that seemed designed to remind kids like him that they didn't belong in places like this, but mostly, Jake was angry at himself for almost giving up. He had survived 8 years in foster care. He had moved between 12 different homes, changed schools more times than he could count, and dealt with challenges that most of these wealthy people in the audience couldn't even imagine. He had taught himself to play piano with no money for lessons and no one to encourage him. He wasn't going to let some spoiled rich kid destroy his love of music. I'll still perform, Jake told Mrs. Williams, his voice steadier than it had been all evening. She looked relieved. Are you sure? The piano really isn't in good condition. I'm sure, Jake said. But I might need to make some adjustments to what I plan to play. Mrs. Williams nodded and hurried away to continue her preparations. Jake was left alone on the stage with the sabotaged piano, listening to the growing murmur of conversation from the audience. Beyond the curtain, he sat down at the piano bench and placed his hands on the keys. When he pressed down, several notes stuck and others sounded completely wrong. The whole instrument felt different from the piano he had been practicing on for weeks, but Jake had learned to adapt to difficult situations. It was one of the few skills that foster care had taught him really well. Instead of fighting against the piano's problems, he started figuring out how to work with them. He experimented with different keys, identifying which ones worked properly and which ones didn't. He tested the pedals and figured out how to avoid the squeaky one. He even started hearing some interesting sounds in the notes that were out of tune. They created harmonies that he had never heard before. By the time Mrs. Williams came back to tell him it was time to perform, Jake had a plan. It wasn't the plan he had started with, but it was something that might actually work. Ladies and gentlemen, he heard Mrs. Williams announcing to the audience, please welcome Jake, one of our talented scholarship students who will be performing for us this evening. There was polite applause as Jake walked out from behind the curtain. The audience looked exactly as intimidating as he had imagined, hundreds of people in expensive clothes, all watching him. EXPCTNTLY. Jake sat down at the piano bench and looked out at the sea of faces. He could see Mr. and Mrs. Chun near the back, giving him encouraging smiles. He could see Blake in the front row, looking like he was trying not to laugh. Jake placed his hands on the keys and took a deep breath. This was it. This was his moment. To either triumph or fail spectacularly in front of everyone who mattered. The room fell completely silent, waiting for him to begin. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the damaged piano keys. The silence in the ballroom was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. Hundreds of eyes were focused on him, waiting to see what the scholarship kid could do. He pressed the first key and heard the slightly flat note echo through the room. For just a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. This was exactly what Blake had planned, for Jake to sit here in front of all these important people and produce nothing but terrible sounds from a broken instrument. But then Jake remembered something Mrs. Johnson had told him years ago during one of their piano lessons. Music isn't about having perfect instruments or perfect conditions, she had said. Real music comes from the heart, and the heart can make beauty out of anything. Instead of fighting against the piano's flaws, Jake decided to embrace them. He began to play, but not the classical piece he had originally planned. Instead, he started with something completely different, a slow, haunting melody that he created, on the spot, using only the keys that worked properly. The out-of-tune notes that Blake had sabotaged became part of the music, creating an unusual harmony that sounded both broken and beautiful at the same time. The audience, which had been expecting a traditional performance, fell into an even deeper silence. This wasn't what they had anticipated, but there was something captivating about the strange, imperfect sounds coming from the old piano. Jake's confidence grew with every note. He had spent his entire life learning to adapt, to make the best of broken situations, to find hope in places where others saw only problems. This broken piano wasn't his enemy, it was just another challenge to overcome. As he played, Jake began to tell a story through the music. It was the story of a kid who had moved from house to house, never quite belonging anywhere. It was the story of learning to find beauty in imperfect places and strength in difficult circumstances. It was the story of refusing to give up, even when everything seemed designed to make you fail. The melody shifted and grew, becoming more complex and emotional with each passing minute. Jake used the stuck keys as percussion, incorporating their jarring sounds into the rhythm. He avoided the squeaky pedal entirely, creating dynamics through his touch on the keys instead. Even the detuned strings became part of the composition, adding a haunting quality that no perfectly tuned piano could have achieved. In the audience, people began to lean forward in their seats. What had started as polite attention was becoming genuine fascination. This wasn't just a performance, it was something extraordinary. They were witnessing someone take a broken instrument and create something more beautiful than most people could make with perfect tools. Blake, sitting in the front row, watched in growing horror as his perfect plan fell apart. The piano was definitely sabotaged. He could hear that it wasn't working properly. But instead of being humiliated, Jake was somehow turning the sabotage into art. The broken sounds were becoming part of something magnificent. As Jake's performance continued, the music began to build toward something powerful and uplifting. The melodies that had started sad and lonely were evolving into something hopeful and triumphant. It was like listening to someone overcome tremendous odds in real time. Mrs. Chun, sitting in the back of the room, had tears streaming down her face. She could hear Jake's entire life story in this music, all the loss and loneliness, but also all the strength and determination that had carried him through. Even people who knew nothing about music could feel the emotion pouring from the stage. Jake wasn't just playing notes, he was sharing his soul with everyone in the room. And somehow, the broken piano was making it even more powerful. The imperfections weren't hiding his talent, they were revealing something deeper and more meaningful than technical perfection ever could. As Jake moved into the final section of his improvised composition, he pulled out every technique had ever learned. His fingers flew across the working keys with incredible speed and precision. He created thunderous sounds by using the stuck keys as percussion instruments. He built to a climax that had everyone in the audience holding their breath. And then, with perfect timing, he brought everything down to a single, pure note, one of the few keys that still worked perfectly. The note hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity before finally fading into complete silence. For a moment, nobody moved. The entire ballroom was frozen in stunned silence. Then one person started clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, applauding with an intensity that shook the walls. People were cheering, crying, and shouting, "Bravo!" like they had just witnessed something that would change their lives forever. Jake sat at the piano bench, hardly able to believe what had just happened. He had expected to fail miserably. Instead, he had just given the performance of his lifetime. Mrs. Williams rushed onto the stage, her face glowing with excitement and pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced over the continuing applause, "I think we can all agree that this young man represents exactly what Riverside Academy is all about, taking raw talent and helping it shine." The applause grew even louder. Jake looked out at the audience and saw faces filled with genuine admiration and respect. These weren't looks of pity or charity. These people were looking at him like he was someone special, someone worthy of their attention and respect. In the front row, Blake was still sitting in his chair, looking like he had been hit by a truck. His plan hadn't just failed, it had backfired spectacularly. Instead of humiliating Jake, the sabotage piano had given him the opportunity to display an even more impressive kind of talent. Blake had accidentally created the perfect stage for Jake to prove that he belonged at Riverside Academy more than Blake himself did. As Jake finally stood up from the piano bench, a woman in an elegant evening gown approached the stage. She was older, with silver hair and kind eyes, and something about her presence made the crowd quiet down. "Excuse me," she said to Jake, her voice carrying easily through the room. "I'm Elizabeth Ashford, Blake's mother. I wanted to tell you that in 40 years of attending events like this, I have never heard anything as moving as what you just played." Jake's eyes widened. Blake's mother was praising his performance? He glanced down at Blake, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "More than that," Mrs. Ashford continued, "I want to offer you something. My foundation provides scholarships to the Wellington Music Conservatory downtown. It's one of the best music schools in the country. If you're interested, I would like to arrange for you to audition for a full scholarship there." The room erupted in applause again. Jake felt dizzy with shock and gratitude. A real music school? A full scholarship? It was more than he had ever dared to dream. "I think I'd like that very much," Jake managed to say, his voice barely audible over the continuing applause. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Jake found himself surrounded by admirers. Donors pressed business cards into his hands, offering opportunities and connections. Other students from Riverside Academy approached him with new respect and friendship in their eyes. Lily appeared at his side, beaming with pride. "I told you that you had something special," she said. "I just didn't know it was this special." Even some of Blake's former friends came over to congratulate Jake, clearly impressed by what they had witnessed. Blake himself had disappeared early in the evening, probably to avoid the embarrassment of watching his victim become the hero of the night. As Mr. and Mrs. Chun drove Jake home that night, he stared out the window at the familiar streets and felt like everything had changed. A few hours ago, he had been just another foster kid trying to survive at a school where he didn't belong. Now he had a real future ahead of him, with opportunities he had never imagined possible. "We're so proud of you," Mrs. Chun said from the front seat. "Not just for tonight, but for how you've handled everything. You've shown real character." Jake smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. All those years of moving from house to house, all those days of feeling like an outsider, all those hours practicing on broken keyboards and dreaming of something better. It had all led to this. Blake had tried to destroy him with that sabotaged piano, but instead he had given Jake the perfect opportunity to show the world what he was really made of. Sometimes Jake realized the worst things that happen to you can become the foundation for the best things that are yet to come. The broken piano had produced broken sounds, but in Jake's hands, those broken sounds had become something beautiful. And maybe that was the most important lesson of all, that you don't need perfect conditions to create something perfect. You just need the courage to turn your struggles into strength, your obstacles into opportunities, and your pain into something powerful enough to move the world. As they pulled into the driveway of his foster home, Jake knew that this was just the beginning of his real story. Tomorrow he would call the Wellington Music Conservatory. Tomorrow he would start preparing for auditions and scholarships and a future that finally looked as bright as the music he could create. But tonight, he was just a 16-year-old kid who had learned that sometimes the most broken things can make the most beautiful music.